Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a close look at a small but, I think profoundly significant fragment of the Bible. It's just a few short references, really, but they focus our attention on one of Scripture's most unexpected and, often overlooked groups, the Buzites. And specifically, we're zooming in on the young man Elihu, whose brief but powerful appearance completely shifts the direction of that monumental discussion we find in the book of Job.
It's such a rewarding mission, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we're really leaning on this principle that even the smallest fragments of information in Scripture are just rich with meaning. I
Exactly.
mean, the sources give us, minimal details about the Buzites. You get a genealogy here, a
Yeah.
prophetic mention there.
Not much to go on at first glance.
Not at all. And then suddenly you get this detailed 6-chapter intervention in Job. So our goal in this deep dive is to synthesize these details. We want to see what this people group, through the voice of Elihu, reveals about God's expansive sovereignty.
His work among those who stood, geographically and culturally outside the formal established covenant of Israel.
Precisely.
And that paradox you mentioned, finding such deep universal truth in just a few specific details, I think that's exactly what draws thoughtful believers to the biblical text. We so often assume that true wisdom and the fear of the Lord were exclusively confined to the borders of Abraham's immediate descendants.
It's a very common assumption.
But the Buzites, they exist firmly in that patriarchal world, yet they're separate from the covenant line of Isaac and Jacob. They offer a surprising and I think a rather stunning answer. God raises up witnesses and illuminates truth wherever he wills.
And that universality is just so crucial for application today. We're taking the time to conduct a really serious, thoughtful analysis. This is based on essays designed for adult Christians who are looking for understanding, for clarification, and for practical spiritual application.
All right, this isn't a rushed survey.
No, not at all. We want to understand the foundational historical facts, grasp the theological implications of Elihu's words, and then apply those truths to how we live and speak about God in our own lives.
So to truly appreciate Elihu's intervention, we can't just drop him onto the scene. We need to anchor him in his world. Let's start with the name itself. Where do the Buzites come from, genealogically speaking?
Okay, for that we have to turn back to the foundational texts in Genesis, specifically chapter 22, verses 20 through 22.
And the timing of this is interesting, isn't it? It's right after the test on Mount Moriah.
It is. It's almost presented as a sidebar. Abraham receives this report about his brother Nahor, who, you remember, settled back in Mesopotamia after Abraham journeyed to Canaan. And the report is that Nahor had several sons. The text lists them, and among them are Uz, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother.
So Buz is Abraham's nephew.
Abraham's nephew.
Yeah, that places the Buzites firmly within the very broad umbrella of Abraham's extended family.
It does. They are Semitic peoples. They share a common ancestor in Noah's son Shem, and more specifically, they belong to this wider clan that stems from Terah and Nahor.
So we're talking about cultural cousins, in a way.
Precisely. And that kinship is just vital to establishing the context for the book of Job. These are not completely foreign or isolated peoples.
Right.
They would have shared the same foundational linguistic roots, similar customs about hospitality and honor, and primarily followed a pastoral, nomadic, or semi-nomadic lifestyle. That was typical of the Fertile Crescent's periphery.
And that shared background is what allows for this incredibly sophisticated theological debate in Job to feel so grounded and real.
Absolutely.
And I find it interesting how the text so carefully links Buz to Uz. Why is the sequence of the names important there in Genesis 22?
Well, listing Buz immediately after Uz, the firstborn, I think it's more than just, keeping a family register. It's establishing a geographic connection. Uz, the firstborn, gives his name to the land of Uz, which is, of course, where the entire drama of Job unfolds. We see that in Job 1, verse 1. So, Elihu the Buzite is literally a man from the land next door, or maybe a descendant of a related clan still living in the region where Uz settled.
So it's not a coincidence. The writer is deliberately anchoring the debate in a clear historical and geographic reality that ties directly back to Abraham's own family.
I think so, yes.
That's a powerful connection. It helps us realize that the Job narrative isn't some abstract fable set in, some unknown mystical location.
Right.
It's happening in a recognizable world right next to the great stories of the patriarchs. So when we think of the land of Uz, what exactly should we picture? What kind of world did Elihu inhabit?
This scholarly consensus, for the most part, places the land of Uz along the desert's edge. possibly near or even overlapping with Edom, Aram, or what we would now call northern Arabia.
Okay.
We have that supporting verse in Lamentations 4, verse 21, which speaks of daughter Edom, you who live in the land of Uz. And that suggests a location southeast of Israel.
So that makes it a crossroads, doesn't it? I mean, a place where multiple cultures would have intersected.
Absolutely. This was not some isolated backwater. This was a region traversed by ancient trade routes. It was where city-states met vast deserts, where caravans moved between the great powers of the day, and where herdsmen managed significant wealth, just as Job himself possessed.
And in a setting like that, a high-stakes setting, values like family honor and moral seriousness and a reverence for the divine, that would be critical.
They weren't peripheral. They were the essential social and spiritual currency that held that society together. And that helps explain why Job and his friends, and later Elihu, operate with such complex moral and theological frameworks. They're not making this up on the spot.
So we've established their place in the patriarchal world, but they don't just disappear from the biblical record after Job's time. We find a specific, much later inclusion of the Buzites in the prophetic writings. Why is Jeremiah 25, verse 23, so significant for understanding God's jurisdiction?
This is a truly crucial text for our deep dive. Because Jeremiah, speaking centuries after the probable time of Job, lists Buz alongside Dedan and Tema, these are neighboring nations, as those who will face the sweep of God's judgments and calls to accountability.
A prophetic oracle about judgment. Now, if God is speaking judgment to these nations, what does that imply about their relationship with him? They're not just, off the radar.
Not at all. It implies a declaration of universal divine jurisdiction. God is not merely the deity of Israel, he is the sovereign Lord of all the earth.
So this is God saying, you are also accountable to me.
Unquestionably. The fact that the prophet names the Buzites in this context declares unequivocally that the Lord's rule extends far beyond the boundaries of the covenant he established specifically with Israel through Moses at Sinai. The God who chose Abraham is the same God who weighs the knowledge, the hearts, and the actions of all the neighboring clans.
That reinforces that central theological concept, doesn't it? That there is no cultural or geographical corner of the world where people are exempt from the requirement to give an account to the Creator.
Precisely. They are addressed by God, which means they are responsible to seek him and to respond to the light they have. And the Buzites, in this context, they serve as a concrete, tangible example of a people held to God's standard. It demonstrates God's freedom to engage with and demand righteousness from the nations.
And that is the stage upon which Elihu, a man of the nations, steps forward to speak the truth.
That's the one.
That sets the scene perfectly. So let's move from the geography and lineage of Buz to the high drama of the book of Job itself. Let's turn now to the centerpiece of this discussion, the book of Job. And it's so important to reiterate that this entire story takes place among non-Israelite people. And the opening, it immediately establishes Job's moral stature in that world.
It does. Job is not introduced as a man who is, seeking integrity. He possesses it in abundance. The text describes him as blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil.
That's about as high as praise gets.
It is. And that portrait of virtue, coupled with the assertion that he was the greatest man among all the people of the East, it situates this entire debate firmly among these wise men of the nations. Their whole life focus was moral seriousness and wrestling with the deepest questions of suffering and divine justice.
So after Job loses everything, we enter this great cycle of debate with his three older friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Help us understand the weight of these men. They weren't just three guys off the street, were they?
Oh, far from it, no. These men represented the pinnacle of regional wisdom. Temanah, which was Eliphaz's home, was famous throughout the ancient Near East for its wisdom. Jeremiah even mentions it.
So they were the established experts.
They were the traditional experts, yes. They were operating within the established framework that linked all suffering directly and proportionately to sin. They were serious men, but ultimately their theology was too rigid, too tidy.
And the debate, which spans chapters 3 all the way through 31, is just, it's exhausting. They go round and round. Job insists on his innocence, the friends insist on his sin, and the discussion just grinds to a halt.
It results in a profound, heavy silence. Job has issued his final, powerful oath of innocence in chapter 31, and the three friends, having exhausted every traditional, tidy argument they had, they just fall silent.
They've got nothing left to say.
They've failed to prove Job's guilt, and in doing so, they have failed to speak accurately about God's complex ways. And this is the crucial moment of dramatic tension. The case is stalled, justice feels unserved, and God's character has been misrepresented by all sides, including Job, who verged on accusing the Almighty of injustice.
And into that theological impasse steps Elihu, and he's identified with remarkable precision. Elihu, son of Barakel the Buzite, of the family of Ram. This young man, a descendant of the Buzites we just discussed, breaks the silence.
And his entrance is just brilliant. He hasn't been introduced before, and we learn he's been there the entire time, listening to the whole argument. The whole thing. And the fact that he waited patiently while three older, established wise men argued, that demonstrates incredible deference and self-control, which he then addresses head-on.
He knew the cultural expectation, age should speak first.
Exactly. He starts by explaining his initial deference in Job 32. He says, I am young in years and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom.
He's showing his respect for the norms. In that ancient Semitic world, the word of the elders was practically law.
It was. But then his theological conviction overrides his cultural deference. He finds the courage to speak because the truth as he sees it has been suppressed, and God's honor is on the line.
And this is where his identity as a Buzite, a man outside the primary covenantal structures, becomes so compelling.
It really does, he declares. But it is the Spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding. And this is a radical challenge to the entire premise of that stalled debate. Elihu is arguing that true insight is not automatically acquired through advanced years or social status or even a particular lineage. It is a sovereign gift from God, breathed into the human spirit.
That one statement fundamentally changes the conversation. It means wisdom is spiritual, not chronological. So what is the substance of the critique that flows from this conviction?
Elihu is unique because he is angry at both parties, but for different reasons. He's angry at the friends because they judged Job based on an inadequate theology, linking all suffering to some hidden sin.
Right.
But he is equally angry at Job because Job had become so fixated on defending his own righteousness that he had effectively accused God of injustice. Elihu's entire speech, all 6 chapters, is structured to uphold the perfect justice and the absolute sovereignty of God.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to unpacking those core correctives because they are the theological meat of this whole section, and they set the stage for God's eventual speech. The first corrective is his insistence on God's perfect justice.
He hits this theme repeatedly, but maybe most powerfully in Job 34, verse 10. Far be it from God to do evil, from the Almighty to do wrong.
He's drawing a line in the sand.
He is. Job had come dangerously close to implying that God was arbitrary or cruel in allowing his suffering. Elihu points out the theological impossibility of this. If God were corruptible, if he were unjust, he would instantly cease to be God, because justice is intrinsic to his very nature.
So Elihu establishes that Job's real struggle isn't with an unjust God, but with his own finite misunderstanding of an infinite, unchallengeable being.
That's the heart of it.
So if God is perfectly just, then the friend's narrow explanation that suffering always equals simple punishment, that must also be wrong. This leads to the second massive theological leap Elihu introduces, the pedagogical purpose of suffering.
This is perhaps Elihu's greatest insight, and it's what distinguishes him entirely from the 3 older friends. They only saw suffering as a punitive response to past sin. A causes B.
Very transactional.
Very. Elihu introduces this profound concept that affliction is often a tool of refinement and warning. He details how God uses affliction, he says twice, even 3 times, to teach, to warn, and ultimately to turn a person back from the path of destruction, or the pit, as he calls it.
Can you elaborate on that difference between punitive and refining suffering, based on what Elihu says?
Yes. Punitive suffering is simply consequence. You sin, you get punished. End of story. Refining suffering, which Elihu emphasizes, is preventative or pedagogical.
So it's for our good.
It's for our good, to shape us. In Job 33, he gives specific examples. He says God speaks through dreams or visions, warning the individual before they act wrongly. Or God uses pain and illness to humble a person, to make them unable to follow destructive paths, and in doing so, preserving them from ultimate ruin.
So the purpose is not to exact payment for a sin.
No. It's to save the soul and restore the relationship. This is such a sophisticated understanding, and it shows wisdom operating at a very high level, completely outside of the formal law of Moses.
That truly corrects the narrow, mechanical theology of Eliphaz and his companions. And this focus on God's higher purpose then transitions into Elihu's third major theme, magnifying God's overwhelming majesty.
Yes, after correcting Job's sense of entitlement to an explanation, Elihu shifts the focus entirely from Job's misery to God's greatness. He asks a rhetorical question that brooks no argument. God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed his ways for him or said to him, "You have done wrong"?
He's demanding humility from Job by emphasizing the sheer, unapproachable power of the Creator. It's a perspective shift.
Exactly. How dare a finite creature attempt to challenge or prescribe the ways of the infinite creator? Elihu emphasizes that God's power is inseparable from his wisdom.
Yeah.
Because his power is so exalted, his ways are unsearchable to us, and therefore we must trust the perfection of his judgment, even when it seems completely opaque.
And this theme, it successfully prepares Job for the voice from the whirlwind, which will essentially ask the same kinds of questions.
It's the perfect setup.
And this emphasis on God's infinite majesty, it culminates in Elihu's final practical corrective, the call to awe, using the natural world.
Yes, Elihu becomes the master instructor in general revelation here. He points Job away from his navel-gazing despair, and he points him toward the sky. He begins speaking about the rolling clouds, the thunder, the wind, the rain, the snow. In Job 37, he asks Job to behold what God has made, inquiring, "Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash?" It's a simple question with an impossibly complex answer.
It's an argument that the observable universe is powerful evidence against self-focus and complaint. When your suffering has narrowed your world down to just your own pain, look up at the majesty God displays every single day.
That's the pastoral insight right there. Humility arises naturally from beholding God's works. The vastness, the mystery, the raw power demonstrated in creation forces Job, and it forces us, to acknowledge our own limited understanding and the infinite competence of the one who controls all those elements.
He's using common grace, the evidence that's available to all nations, to argue for submission.
Jesus.
So we have this thorough, multi-layered critique from Elihu. But the big question is, did it work? We know God speaks immediately after Elihu concludes. Does the divine confirmation vindicate this young Buzite?
The textual structure, I think, strongly suggests vindication. When the Lord finally speaks from the storm, starting in chapter 38, he doesn't quote Elihu directly, but his path of questioning follows the exact focus Elihu had introduced.
The unsearchable wonder of the Creator.
Exactly. The wisdom, the power, the universal rule, demanding humility from Job. God basically ignores the arguments of the three friends, and he begins right where Elihu left off, asking, "Can you create the world? Can you even comprehend a fraction of it?"
And crucially, we have to remember the conclusion of the book in Job 42. God directly rebukes the three older, established wise men.
Yes. It's a stunning moment. God says to Eliphaz, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has." That is a stunning condemnation of their rigid, narrow theology.
And the rebuke requires sacrifice and, tellingly, Job's intercession on their behalf. They had status in years, but they spoke wrongly about God's character in this specific situation.
They did.
And Elihu.
Scripture never rebukes Elihu by name. The text simply lets him fade from the scene, leaving him implicitly validated. He stands as the young man, the Buzite, who successfully upheld God's justice and greatness before the whirlwind even arrived, proving that wisdom and accurate theology were not limited to a single lineage.
The narrative of Elihu the Buzite takes us directly into one of the deepest theological concepts in Scripture. I mean, if Elihu, a man outside the covenant line of Israel, could speak this rightly about God's justice, his pedagogical use of suffering, and his universal power, what does this tell us about God's relationship with the rest of humanity?
Well, the theological significance here is just monumental. It's because it demonstrates that God's truth is not restricted solely to the covenant line of Israel. While salvation history, the specific plan of redemption, absolutely centers on Abraham's family, the Lord of the universe simultaneously bears witness to himself among all peoples, preparing them for that redemption.
So we're talking about truth existing beyond descent or covenant specificity. How do we formalize that understanding? Is there a term for that?
There is. This brings us right to the doctrine of general revelation, the foundational knowledge of God that is available to all people at all times. The Apostle Paul lays this out for us definitively in Romans chapter 1.
Okay.
Paul states that what can be known about God, specifically, his eternal power and his divine nature, is evident in the world, because God has made it plain to humanity through creation.
So general revelation is the universal testimony of nature and conscience. Elihu's argument using the weather and the stars to prove God's majesty, that perfectly embodies this.
It's a textbook case, absolutely. His insights weren't arbitrary. They harmonized completely with the moral law written on the heart and the majestic display of power in the cosmos. Elihu is speaking from the light he possessed, the light of creation, and a conscience deeply cultivated by the fear of the Lord.
Even though he existed before the full special revelation of the law given to Moses at Sinai.
Exactly. And the result, as Paul notes, is that all humanity, including the Buzites, are left without excuse for failing to acknowledge God's existence and power.
And the Apostle Paul, he continued to use this very concept when he preached to the Gentiles centuries later. Where do we see this echo of Elihu's argument in the book of Acts?
We see it clearly in two distinct episodes. In Acts 14, when Paul and Barnabas are addressing the pagan crowd in Lystra, Paul confirms that God did not leave himself without testimony. And he points to God's physical kindness giving rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling their hearts with food and gladness. This is tangible, daily, physical evidence of God's goodness in existence, intended to draw people to him.
And then, when Paul goes to the highly educated philosophers in Athens in Acts 17, he builds on that concept. He connects geography and human history to God's plan.
That is perhaps the most powerful statement of God's universal lordship outside of the book of Job itself. Paul tells the Athenians that God is the one who made the world and everything in it. And then in verses 26 and 27, he declares that God marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands.
Okay, and why did God do that? Why set geographical boundaries and historical timing for all nations, including the Buzites and the Athenians? What's the purpose?
The text is explicit. God did this specifically so that people would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Even the precise location of the Buzites near Uz in Edom was part of God's strategic plan to draw those particular clans into a knowledge of himself, leveraging common grace and the universal testimony of creation.
So the narrative of Job is therefore a perfect demonstration of God's active engagement with the nations before the formal covenant was in place.
It fundamentally is. Job, who lived outside Israel and before Sinai, he knew God intimately as creator and judge. He was operating within a rich moral framework. His faith was so sophisticated that even in his deepest misery, he could express this longing for ultimate vindication, declaring, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth."
That confession, a hope for a Redeemer and resurrection, is just astonishing coming from a pre-covenant man.
It highlights the power of general revelation, coupled with specific and perhaps inherited knowledge of the true God. And Elihu the Buzite, he steps into that debate to anchor Job's sophisticated longing back in God's immutable character. He insists that God is worthy of trust regardless of what Job felt or understood.
He modeled how a man of the nations could speak truly and rightly about God.
That's it.
And this universal perspective that God is working outside the immediate confines of one nation, it's just so essential for understanding the grand scope of the Bible.
It elevates the entire Old Testament. The inclusion of the Buzites in God's dealings, from Genesis all the way to Jeremiah, it doesn't diminish Israel's unique covenantal calling. Rather, it highlights God's absolute lordship over every single tribe and tongue. He chooses Israel to be the channel of redemption, but he never stops being the sovereign ruler over every other group.
And this universal authority is the necessary prerequisite for the New Testament fulfillment. It has to be there.
Exactly. It prepares the world for Christ. God is sovereign over all nations because he intends to bless all nations. As Paul writes in Galatians, when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, gathering both Jew and Gentile, the descendants of Abraham and those like the Buzites, into the blessing foretold to Abraham.
Wow.
Elihu, the faithful Buzite, stands as an ancient vital witness to this far-reaching universal purpose of God.
We've moved from genealogy to the high points of biblical theology. Now let's pivot hard toward application. If the Buzites and Elihu are meant to be more than just historical fragments, what are the immediate spiritual lessons for us as thoughtful believers here in the 21st century?
The core lesson, I think, is that Elihu's example confronts our spiritual comfort zone. And the first lesson, drawn directly from his entrance, is the principle of humility, which is not just an abstract virtue, but a necessary prerequisite for wisdom.
He waited out of respect for the aged, but he spoke because God's honor was at stake.
And that dual action is the key. He waited, showing deference, then he spoke, showing courage rooted in theological conviction. And his core declaration that wisdom is a divine gift, the spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding, that is deeply humbling.
It is.
Wisdom is not automatically granted by years or advanced degrees or by seniority in the church.
This aligns perfectly with Proverbs, which says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Wisdom is accessible to a young Buzite, and yet it was potentially absent from three older, famous, wise men.
And the application here is a profound challenge to everyone. It summons older believers to avoid spiritual arrogance, reminding them that decades of experience do not substitute for dependence on the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And at the same time, it encourages younger believers not to despise the gifts God has given them simply because they lack years or formal status. True wisdom always maintains a posture of dependence. We have to actively seek understanding from the Lord, not simply derive it from our own accomplishments.
And that posture of dependence leads us right to the second, equally crucial lesson, which is the need for guarded and careful speech, especially when we're discussing God's actions and suffering.
This is such a powerful warning for us today, particularly in a culture where people offer glib, immediate answers to life's deepest problems. You have to remember, God declared that Job's three friends spoke many true things about God's attributes, yet he still condemned them for having not spoken the truth about me.
That is a critical distinction. They were theologically correct on general points. God is powerful, God is just, but they failed to speak rightly about God's character in the specific context of Job's innocent suffering.
And that failure led them to accuse a righteous man wrongly and to misrepresent the heart of God. Elihu, in contrast, insisted that God is never unjust, but he also protested the easy conclusion that all pain is strictly punishment. The lesson is simple but hard. When we speak of providence or discipline or justice, we have to speak with deep reverence and extreme care.
It calls for a reverence that doesn't demand neat, clean answers from God. It seems we're called to honor the limitlessness of his understanding, not try to box it in.
We must protest glib answers. When someone is suffering, we are called to comfort them, to point them to God's trustworthy character, not to immediately provide a tidy diagnosis of their hidden sin or their future reward. Our job is to magnify God's integrity, even when his plan is completely opaque to us.
The third lesson forces us to break out of our spiritual provincialism, broadening our vision for where and how God works in the world.
Yes, the example of Elihu the Buzite, a man of the nations speaking right theology, is an absolute rebuke to any ethnocentrism in our spiritual lives. God's witness shines in the most unexpected places. In Buz, in Taman, even in Nineveh. Elihu's superior insight reminds us that God is sovereignly free to stir up truth wherever he wills, outside of our preferred structures or denominations or theological circles.
So if we only look for wisdom within our own community, we might miss the common grace God has extended to others.
That's the application. We should actively expect to encounter surprising insight, deep conviction, and God-given wisdom in people who may not share our particular covenantal expression. This is common grace at work, preserving truth and stirring up conscience across all cultures. If a Buzite who lived outside the covenant could speak accurately about God's nature, we, with the benefit of the New Testament, must humbly recognize that the Spirit's work is not confined to our immediate institutions. It encourages us to listen generously and to learn humbly.
The fourth lesson brings us back to nature, leveraging Elihu's extensive use of creation to combat Job's self-pity.
He used the massive power of the storm, the lightning arcs, the complexity of the weather phenomena that are constant and overwhelming, to combat Job's narrow self-focus. The purpose is so clear. All corrects complaint.
Right.
Creation is a daily, visible, and available teacher of God's power and wisdom, exactly as Psalm 19 says. The heavens declare the glory of God.
So when personal trouble or despair or grief narrows our focus, which it inevitably does, Elihu teaches us to look outward and upward intentionally.
Yes, this becomes a spiritual discipline. We are encouraged to let beholding the works of the Lord stretch our souls and our perspectives. The vastness of the universe, the distance between galaxies, the complexity of a single drop of rain. It reminds us that our personal equation of pain is just one tiny complex thread being woven by an infinitely wise and infinitely powerful weaver.
We use creation to cultivate humility and awe, and in doing so, regain a proper perspective on our troubles relative to His majesty.
Well said.
Finally, Elihu's ultimate contribution is that he encouraged steadfast hope, even when the intellectual answers remained elusive.
That's the key pastoral takeaway. Elihu never gave Job a clean answer to why he was suffering. He never did. He simply succeeded in reorienting Job to the one who does all things well. He urged Job toward worship. He said, "Remember to extol his work, which people have praised in song." He asks us to look at the power and justice of God and conclude, who is a teacher like him?
So the right conclusion to any spiritual debate or personal crisis isn't necessarily a successful argument, but a bowed heart focused on the trustworthiness of God.
Precisely. When we magnify the Lord, when we establish in our minds that God is exalted in his power and righteousness, we find reliable footing again. The greatest hope is not in finding the answer to why me, but in establishing that the character of God, his integrity, his justice, his power, his mercy, is utterly trustworthy. The Buzite, Elihu, directs us to that ultimate anchor of faith.
This detailed deep dive into the Buzites, through the surprising wisdom of Elihu, magnifies the God who rules the nations, grants understanding wherever he chooses, and demands reverence from all people. Our calling, then, is not to win theological arguments, but to know him, remembering that God is exalted in his power.
And the essay we're drawing from concludes by bringing us back to Elihu's final words, which serve as a magnificent summary and conclusion to this entire debate about God's nature. Let's revisit Job 37, verses 23 and 24.
The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness he does not oppress. Therefore people revere him, for does he not have regard for all the wise in heart?
That passage just encapsulates the dual nature of God that Elihu spent chapters defining. His overwhelming, unsearchable power, yet also his absolute righteousness. Because he is mighty, we cannot fully reach him or fully understand his ways, but because he is righteous and just, he never oppresses. The call to reverence stems directly from recognizing that duality. True wisdom, Elihu implies, stems not from intellectual achievement or status, but from this fear of the Lord.
And that final promise is so hopeful. He has regard for all who are wise in heart. He pays attention. He sees.
He honors those who fear him. The fact that God regards the wise in heart implies that wisdom is an internal condition of humility and reverence. And if a Buzite, a man standing outside the formal covenant, could demonstrate this wisdom and speak rightly about God's character, then we, with the full light of the gospel and the new covenant, are called to an even deeper reverence and humility. May you be encouraged this week to reflect on the nature of God's far-reaching sovereignty, the wisdom found in a humbled heart, and the majesty revealed in the very sky above you.
Go in peace and seek the wisdom that comes from the breath of the Almighty.